Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to your Fatherhood and COVID-19, a conversation about practice, research, and policy webinar. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode. If you would like to submit a question at any time during the webinar, you may use the chat box located on the lower left corner of your screen. Simply type your question into the box and click on the send button. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Jessica Pearson. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and greetings. I want to start off by introducing the Fatherhood Research and Practice Network. I'm Jessica Pearson, direct the Center for Policy Research and co-direct with Jay Fagan, the Fatherhood Research and Practice Network. We have three goals. We try to promote rigorous research, build evaluation capacity in the fatherhood community by communicating with practitioners and policymakers about the results of research on fatherhood practice, and we try to disseminate that information to research and practice and policy audiences. And these webinars are one step, one effort towards that goal. This webinar is being recorded, and the webinar recording and the slides from today's presentation will be posted on our site, www.frpn.org, where you can also find the results of research that FRPN has sponsored dealing with fatherhood practice. We've been in existence since 2013. For 6 years, we were funded by the Federal Office of Health and Human Services, Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. During that time, we funded 21 research studies on fatherhood programs and practice. We also made 11 awards to states to examine policy initiatives or to try to pursue policy initiatives to encourage father inclusion in state level programs and policies, and all that the reports and articles from those efforts can be found on our website. And heads up, we are currently in the process of publishing a book that features 13 of these studies, and it will be out in the spring of this year. We've got an exciting panel today. I want to briefly introduce you to them. Rich Tolman, professor of social work at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and also project lead for the Michigan Action Plan for Fatherhood Involvement, one of the 11 states working on father inclusion under an FRPN planning grant. Sherry Tillis, Executive Vice President and COO of Fathers and Family Support Center, a responsible fatherhood program based in St. Louis, Missouri, and recipient of a new HMRF Fatherhood Award. Armin Perry, professor of social work at the University of Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky, and principal investigator of For Your Child, a responsible fatherhood program. Also recipient of an FRPN award to study engagement of mothers in co-parenting interventions. Amy Lindholm, a management analyst with the Friend of the Court Bureau of the State Court of Administrative Offices in the state of Michigan, and a member with Rich Tolman of the Michigan Action Plan for Fatherhood Involvement. Erin Fritsch, who's Child Support Director for the Michigan Office of Child Support, a member of the Michigan Action Plan for Father Involvement, and also a member of the Michigan Poverty Task Force for the state of Michigan, which is charged with ensuring that state government is fighting poverty. And Lori Friedman, who is an associate professor of instruction, coordinator of continuing education and professional development for the School of Social Work at Temple University, and an expert in remote learning and online platforms. So why are we doing a webinar on COVID-19 and fatherhood? Well, simply put, it's because fatherhood program, like every other area of service delivery, has been upended by the pandemic, and remote formats have taken hold, and we are interested in exploring the changes in content, format, resources, and effectiveness, what that has brought. We're going to be asking today whether new parenting issues and challenges for fathers have emerged, whether new formats have taken hold, and how they have fared, whether they present new opportunities, strengths, and new challenges. We're going to be looking at new methods of conducting convenings and gatherings using remote technologies. The impact of fatherhood of the pandemic on fatherhood issues. In some respects, it may make these fatherhood issues more salient. In other respects, it may present more challenges given the massive unemployment consequences of the pandemic and the funding burdens that state and local governments are experiencing. We're going to be waltzing through some of the research on virtual learning for adults and the best practices that it suggests, and then speculating about the new research questions, issues, policy initiatives, and training needs that all this has inspired. We will be, please type in your questions in the chat functions, but note that we're going to be addressing them at the end. And so we have a packed agenda, and we're going to move to Rich Tolman, who will be talking about some of the emerging new issues that COVID has brought. Rich?
Great, thanks so much. Hi everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to be able to share some observations on this panel. The points I'm going to make today are mainly drawn from discussions with fatherhood providers, many of whom are fathers themselves. The talking points, the bullet points you see, are mainly drawn from notes from weekly calls that I co-facilitate with Dr. Carolyn Dayton from Wayne State University School of Social Work. Dr. Dayton and I initiated the idea for a call to serve fatherhood program leaders as they face the challenges of the pandemic. The challenges when we launched the call, which was last spring as the pandemic really began to spread, were both programmatic, that is, like issues about how fatherhood programs needed to address the massive changes that were resulting from COVID, and also personal for the fatherhood leaders we were aiming the phone-in discussions for. In the Metro Detroit area where we work, there was we're experiencing at the start of the pandemic a really high level of COVID cases, and we were aware that the fatherhood leaders in the area were experiencing not only programmatic stresses from needing to adjust to the changes that were happening, but they were also experiencing personal loss and illness themselves. And so we really felt it was important in terms of addressing COVID to reach out to and find ways to support and build mutual aid for the people doing the fatherhood work themselves. So that group we originally thought would serve just mainly the folks in the local Michigan area, but it quickly grew in scope, and we've had regular attendance from fatherhood program providers around the United States in the call now, from New Mexico, Kentucky, Illinois, New Jersey, among others of our regular call-ins. So it grew in scope. And I'm going to put in the chat, if I can manage my technology here. Excuse me for a second, using the screen for multiple purposes here. I'm putting in the chat the landing spot for anyone who's interested as you listen. If this call seems like something that could serve you or a good fit for people that you know working in the fatherhood realm, this is the place to go to find the link for the weekly meetings. So I put that in the chat. And if anybody has trouble finding it or wants to know more information, please feel free to contact me and I can get you connected up and get you more additional information. So the list of issues you see on the slide probably aren't surprising, and there are many of the issues that families of all sorts are dealing with, and many of us are dealing with ourselves in terms of those sets of issues that we're facing fathers. But I'm going to go through them briefly just to give our webinar today a feel for some of the issues that fathers are experiencing during COVID. Some of these are issues that other panel members are going to expand on much more. And I'm going to just reorder them a little bit from the way you see them on the slide, but I'll be trying to cover some talking points on each of those bullet points. First, let me talk about some of the challenges that we are hearing about facing non-residential dads. This issue of parenting time refusal. In the early days of the lockdown, we heard reports of the kind of disagreements and conflicts that were happening around COVID. For example, kids are living at mom's house, and some dads were being refused parenting time because of concerns about safety and transmission across households. The dad's knocking on the door, mom's refusing to let him in or refusing to send the kids over to the place where he was residing. Not surprisingly, we heard reports about disputes about the need to wear masks around the kids and things like that. Dads without their own stable housing were obviously even more vulnerable to this challenge of getting access to parenting time that they were granted as families were scrambling to make sense of what was safe, and some of those issues got pulled into existing co-parenting and parent time sharing disputes. More generally, COVID raises complexities for sharing parenting time. At the outset of the pandemic and continuing on, there was a clear lack of guidelines for what are safe practices, layoffs, changes in work schedules and work practice like working remotely, complicated arrangements that were initially based on very different conditions. And that led to access and challenging resources, because as these challenges occurred during a time when access to resources that could help make changes or negotiate changes in arrangements like child support payments and parenting time, they became harder or sometimes even impossible to access because they were shut down themselves or inaccessible for in-person contact. So some fathers were left on their own, continue to some extent to be left on their own, though not as much now, to continue to negotiate these pre-COVID agreements without the usual supports that could be there for them to do that in a structural way. So when more was needed, less was available, creating great challenges. In terms of navigating technological barriers, again, these issues are widespread. No one's surprised to see that bullet point up on the list of what fathers are having to deal with. People everywhere are dealing with those issues. But for low-income fathers especially, technological barriers hit hard. Programs serving these fathers themselves needed to address how to offer services for dads remotely, had to scramble to do that. Some fathers in the programs don't have adequate access to smartphones, laptops, bandwidth, or private spaces to attend remote meetings. So programs especially struggled with the need to engage fathers without the usual in-person personal contact that could help draw men into programs. And many have been creatively trying to bridge that gap with programming, but the challenge remains. Fathers, we heard about in the calls, themes of fathers being challenged to maintain interpersonal connections. Barbershops and sports, often sites of connection for dads, were restricted or disappeared. and COVID restrictions cut contact with other family members and friends and places to gather, leaving many dads more isolated. Again, I don't think these are surprising findings, but it's the themes and the issues that have been frequently discussed in our calls. And for those dads living with their children who are out of school or learning remotely, and with shutdowns and restrictions on outside activities, the amount of time spent with families itself can be challenging, and we hear about that. And struggling to balance work responsibilities and space in crowded living spaces with the needs of kids and partners is a daily struggle. The bright side of this, a theme that's come through in the calls and some research as well, is that for many families, this togetherness is also a plus, not just a challenge, with dads finding more opportunities to connect with their kids because of more expanded contact. And the group discussions with fatherhood providers are often focused on in the insight of helping dads to enhance their small everyday activities and their attention to their kids as the best way to build bonds with their children. And kind of the sense is promoting the shifting emphasis from provider roles to caring connection as a key to successful fathering and fathering during this COVID era. And I'm going to put a link in the chat as I negotiate my screens colliding with each other here. Let me try to get that in there for you all. This is a pamphlet that was prepared principally by Dr. Carolyn Dayton, who I mentioned as the co-facilitator of the call, with input from people on the call and from other resources around Michigan mainly, but a pamphlet which emphasizes some of the parenting challenges for fathers and some ideas about how they can successfully father during the COVID era. So I wanted to put that out there for your access as well. So the start of school this fall became a big focus in our supportive calls for fatherhood leaders, addressing safety issues for kids returning to in-person instruction. The balancing of schedules and demands when kids are learning at home were big discussion points, have been big discussion points. And programs are thinking about and considering how to support dads in their role as educators. Many of them have become principals, teachers, maintenance people in the schools that are happening at home unexpectedly, and a great challenge for dads to help negotiate that. And so so there's a focus on considering how residential and non-residential dads could support their kids in this disrupted, transformed school life, challenge that remains. And then there's the navigating the intersection of COVID-19 and the racial justice movement. With the death of George Floyd and the national attention on racial justice that emerged last spring, our calls began to focus on the intersection of that movement with fathering. And our discussions were tracking the disparities and dangers that Black fathers especially and their children face in policing, in surveillance, in the criminal legal system, and within the child support system. And participants very poignantly described their own painful need to discuss the dangers of policing with their own children and the cost of facing societal disrespect and microaggressions in their own life as Black men and in families involved with members who faced racial discrimination. And the challenge remains for how programs for fathers of all races can become sites for anti-racism work. I have to say that this has been one of the most sustaining and helpful aspects of co-hosting these calls. The remarkably compassionate and courageous call participants have sustained really brave and vulnerable discussions on this topic across race, gender, and region. Really deep and complex discussions on this issue. And that gives me hope that this focus on racial justice might develop as an explicit and enriched focus for fatherhood programs who are serving fathers of all races. So there's a lot of work to be done on that emerging work. Jessica, will you just put on the next slide?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, the spirit of these discussions was expressed at one of the meetings by a participant who cited this saying, "We are all in different boats but in the same storm." And that saying was widely shared on the internet as a way to indicate that COVID was impacting people in disparate ways, depending on their circumstances, and to remember that not everybody, some people were experiencing this in much more dire ways than others. But in this context, in the call, it was meant to express the hope that sharing and coming together in the storm, that we could face it collectively. And I think that's been really the spirit of these fatherhood leaders coming together. It's been inspiring, and we certainly need more of that kind of collective discussion and complex discussion, courageous discussion to occur to address these issues of racial justice in the context of fathering. And finally, I just want to say a little bit more about one of the points I haven't discussed yet. I'm pretty much out of my time, so I'm going to go fast here. But domestic violence risk during COVID is one of the challenges facing families and the programs that serve them. And based on our preliminary survey data in Michigan, not coming from these calls, but some of the survey I've done with colleagues looking at domestic violence during COVID, it indicates there's some novel risks of domestic violence in this COVID era that may especially be impacting families with young children. Considerable portion of women in our study reported that partners were doing things like making them follow rules that they would keep them safe from COVID, but that they perceived as hurting them or making them feel unsafe, or punishing them for not following rules they said that their partners thought would keep the family safe, or purposely trying to, even in some percentage, small, but out there, purposely trying to infect them or their children with COVID-19, or withholding protective gear like items like gloves, masks, and disinfectant or hand sanitizer from their families. And so this is a less optimistic view of some of the things that are happening. These are small percentages of families, but risks, novel risks in the COVID era that I think we need to think about addressing. And I think as before COVID and during COVID with these novel risks, it's important for fatherhood programs to think about addressing domestic violence in the context of their work when it occurs. The vast majority of dads are not abusive, but for that percentage that are, certainly fatherhood programs are one of the sites that can begin to help fathers look to address those issues and collaborate on them. And some fathers themselves are targets of domestic violence. So I'm going to put in the chat also a resource for to access about ways in which fatherhood programs can help address and prevent domestic violence for those of you interested.
Thank you. Okay.
Up there. Thanks.
Okay. And Sherry, a hybrid model of fatherhood programming.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Sherry Tillis with Fathers and Families Support Center here in St. Louis, Missouri. And I know that some of you all have already been introduced to the organization, but I will share with you on the next slide where our agency traditionally had offered a 6-week program which met Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And within that model, we provided responsible fatherhood, healthy marriage, financial literacy, as well as male health and wellness, reproductive care, nutrition, family bonding outings, as well as employment services that assisted with training credentials as well as job placement. And we followed up with our participants for an entire year. We also work with them in a holistic model in that each one of our participants has access to their class facilitator, the social worker, a career advisor, and the family therapist. We were in our 3rd week of one of our classes when the agency shut down, and so we quickly were able to pivot to our hybrid model of providing services to our participants, which was drawn up by the staff who work directly with our participants. And our hybrid model initially started off as conference calls, and we were able to get all of our participants calling in with their facilitator. However, we were then able to move over to a Zoom online conferencing platform. And so our 6-week program that traditionally met from 8 to 4 was reduced to Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. We did not have to compromise any of our curriculum topics. However, our case management services, as well as our one-on-one meetings with the family therapists and our attorneys or their career advisors, moved to a one-to-one on the phone case management session, and or when we were able to appropriately social distance, our participants were able to come into our office and meet with the staff one-on-one. Each week during our hybrid model, our participants would actually come to the office on Monday afternoons to pick up incentives as well as PPE items that we made available to the participants. And some of our learnings that we gained through providing this hybrid model is that participants have actually shown an increase in their class participation and the amount of information that they shared during some of the sessions. I know a lot of us were, in the house, and maybe we didn't have individuals that we could talk with about parenting. However, this provided that outlet for those parents that we were working with. We also saw an improvement in our attrition rate, meaning that more of the participants that actually enrolled in the classes actually completed those. And so we had higher rates of enrollment as well as completion. We also saw that our hybrid model, it limited the barriers of in-person participation, meaning that our participants were able to get the services that they needed via phone call and or Zoom conferencing, as well as coming into the office and meeting with our participants. And so in our last graduation that we just held about a week and a half ago, we actually graduated our largest class for the year of 61 participants who successfully completed our family formation program.
Okay. We're going to move on to, thank you, Sherry, and I know that people will have questions about your experience. Armin, talk about formats. You went to a pure virtual model, and so will you talk about that?
Sure, absolutely. The first thing I say is, much like Sherry mentioned, obviously the pandemic hit us at around the same time it hit everyone else, and so we attempted to quickly scramble and figure out ways to take what was an exclusively in-person program and shift on the fly to an online format. It was also the case that one of, if not our biggest assets and selling points was the sense of community that the dads built while they were in group. And so necessarily trying to figure out how to manufacture that in an online environment and replicate it in a way that resembled what it was that attracted most of our dads to us was really, really difficult. So it took us some time to do that. But if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about some of the ways we attempted to do so. And so in doing that, we explored a number of different formats, from Microsoft Teams to, of course, Zoom to GoToMeeting, and each of those formats had pros and cons. But one of the things that I wanted to mention to this group was that it's important, no matter what the format, that facilitators be patient. And I have in the slide here that is both conceptually and practically. From a practical standpoint, it's important to remember that oftentimes, and I think Rich mentioned something about bandwidth in his chat, that folks are receiving information at different speeds, and so sometimes we have to work with our facilitators to get them to be more willing to be comfortable with a couple of seconds of silence, so that there will be time for the dads to be able to hear what they had to say, and also for that time to be dads to be able to respond and give that time to sort of transmit through the internet or whatever the case may be. And conceptually, encouraging facilitators to be more patient in terms of knowing, understanding, and recognizing that the online format was a new environment for a lot of our dads. And it's also a new environment for a lot of our facilitators, right, especially folks who had, again, worn as a sort of a badge of honor their ability to create the sense of community in terms of facilitator cohesion and group cohesion in that face-to-face environment. So facilitators, staff, as well as participants, patience is really, really important. The next thing we had to do is we had to get to a point where we were embracing the current reality and saying, how is it that we can take this and receive it as an opportunity? And so a couple of ways that happened was it allowed us to record the sessions. And so in that way, dads who otherwise may have missed because of whether it be a scheduling issue or some sort of an emergency, we could always give them an opportunity to go back and receive whatever it was that they had missed, because we would record the session. We just send a link. It also gave us an opportunity to do reinforcement and enrichment work, right? So it's one thing to be in group for a couple hours and then have to get out of the group, whatever it is you can get out of it in the moment, but it's something completely different, I think, to have an opportunity to go back and re-immerse yourself in whatever that content was, to be more thoughtful and intentional about the discussion, the conversation. So embracing the online environment was a way for us to be able to make some headway in that regard. The other thing I think is important for people to take into consideration is whether or not they want to go exclusively synchronous or asynchronous or even some combination of two. The ability to either record sessions or even using things like Google Classroom give you an opportunity to put pre-work into the sessions, and it gives dads a chance to, again, engage the material sometimes on their own, give some really, really clear and intentional thought to it, and then give them an opportunity to be able to discuss and have discussion and conversation in those synchronous portions. So again, it's something that folks may want to give some thought to and explore some of the options of being able to mix both synchronous and asynchronous sessions. Next slide, please. Just in terms of some of the other things that so it looks like someone is asking about confidentiality. And so when we submitted online sessions and recorded, before, as a part of our orientation process, we had all of our dads, and this was even before we went online, but even before then, we would always have our dads sign confidentiality agreements. Now, these are things that aren't legally binding, right? But it was an agreement that all of our dads signed about not sharing anything beyond the group. And when we used the Microsoft Teams, we were able to do that because that allowed us to send secure links, so that from a privacy standpoint, we could ensure that the people who were engaging the material were the people who we intended. I think for a while there was some immediate jump to Zoom, but then during the time, Zoom had some security issues, and that was a part of how it was that we decided to go with Microsoft Teams, because it didn't have the security issues that Zoom was having at the time. I think Zoom subsequently secured or tightened some of that up. But anyway, that was a part of the discussion at the time in terms of thinking through what security looked like and confidentiality. Just a couple other things that I think is important for people to give some thought to. One of the things that we had to do some work with our staff and our facilitators with was just the idea that many people were automatically assuming that the level of engagement was going to be diminished simply because it was online. So there was this sort of implicit assumption that if the dads were logging in on their phones or on their computers, that they would sort of be multitasking and doing other things and not really keyed in or locked in to the discussion of the conversation. And we found that to be not necessarily the case. So certainly there were times when you could look at a dad's picture and he was seemingly distracted doing other things, but that wasn't always the case. It was also the case that there's no guarantee that when guys are in person in a traditional sort of format, that they're 100% locked in and they aren't distracted there. So I think in a lot of ways what happened with us was we had folks who were accustomed to a certain delivery method and were reluctant to embrace change simply because it was something new and it was an unknown for many of them. So it may be that as other folks who are doing this work engage the online environment, it may be that you have to confront some of those challenges as well. So for us, more specifically, what we had to do was we had to work with our facilitators to not rush through the content simply to get it over with, simply to check off a box based on some sort of assumption that the guys weren't going to be engaged. And this is connected to what I was saying earlier about having patience and allowing guys to have time to think about what it is they want to say, and not just assuming because the first 10 seconds after you make a question that if you don't hear a response, that means that no one has to say. It may be that people are giving some thought to it. It may be that in other instances, guys were more comfortable using the chat feature, and any number of things that could have been happening. So again, making sure to stay patient and not make the assumption that people weren't engaged simply because it was online. The last thing I'll mention here is that again, in terms of embracing the online environment, is that it creates a number of different opportunities for us to be creative and trying to come up with ways to replicate that in-person, face-to-face sort of synergy that we were so accustomed to. Just a few things. There's a poll option in Microsoft Teams. You can do polls, quizzes. You can even draw in Zoom, we found out. And the drawing gave people a lot of sort of lighthearted fun that could break up some of the monotony and so on and so forth. And so, as I mentioned, if you explore synchronous and asynchronous options, you can do that using things like Google Classroom. You can create discussion boards. It's oftentimes the case for us that dads want to sustain their connection to the group even after their time has come in terms of graduation. And so these discussion boards and things of that nature can live on beyond the initial group and give guys a way to stay connected so as to be able to take advantage of opportunities to build that, what we call bonding social capital, in terms of having connections with other people whose lived experiences may be similar. The next bullet point talks about combining both the Pony Express and Spaces Sprockets, and there what we were looking to do was all of our dads would get workbooks, and when we had to go online, we thought it was important to, again, as best we could, replicate the level of authenticity of our project. So we mailed them their workbooks, and we mailed them the manipulatables and things of that nature that they would use in class, and that gave them an opportunity to actually, during the session online, use them and record themselves and be recorded in terms of on camera, showing us what they were doing and so on and so forth. So anyway, so we began just trying to replicate as best we could the full experience. Being online also gives an opportunity to make use of things like QR codes where you can quickly get dads to supplemental information that maybe otherwise you wouldn't be able to get them to using, again, whether it be smartphones or tablets and so on and so forth. The other thing is, for a sort of a classroom management standpoint, requiring of hand raising and also the moderator having control of the mute button, right, gave us an opportunity to be able to better manage the sort of larger and more extroverted personalities, while also making sure that we were reserving and carving out time for those who may have been more introverted and less likely to engage the discussion because others may have been dominating. So, again, just taking advantage of what it was that was available to us and seeing the move to online as an opportunity as opposed to exclusively as a challenge. Next slide, please. I think that may be all that I have. Yeah, that is all that I have, and I'll be glad to respond to questions when the time is right.
Yeah, thank you so much, Armin. That's great. Amy Lindholm is going to talk a bit about how to do summits, larger convenings using virtual formats. Amy?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning or afternoon to everybody who's out there listening. And actually, could you just go back a slide, Jessica?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm one of the co-leads of our Michigan Action Plan for Father Involvement group, and that was created as a result of the FRPN state planning grant. And early on, we had formed a summit planning committee because we wanted to create more connectivity and resources for fatherhood practitioners in Michigan. That was one of our early goals that we had identified. So I'm going to kind of keep with the theme that others have touched on and talk about some virtual and new technology skill issues as we venture into doing a summit virtually. And the image that you're seeing here is from the landing page of our state summit that we did this year. And one of the new technology skills that I had to learn was how to use this virtual conferencing software to be able to create something like this. Next slide, please. So I'm first going to tell you just a little bit about how we structured our event. We, as I already mentioned, wanted our summit to help connect fatherhood practitioners both to each other, so we wanted there to be a networking opportunity, and we wanted to also provide them with some educational content, professional development, and some of the sessions that we planned out covered topics like legal issues for fathers, including child support, parenting skills, early childhood, men's mental and physical health, and we centered all of those topics around this theme of resilience in uncertain times. And then we also wanted to provide some content for fathers directly. So we offered sessions in the evening that were specifically for fathers on topics like, for example, how to do at-home STEM learning activities with your kids, and STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. Now, I wanted to mention budgets because if anybody out there listening is thinking of doing a summit on your own and you're sort of intimidated by not having a lot of funding, I want to reassure you that our effort was quite grassroots and low budget. So one of the regional groups in Michigan that really led the charge with the summit, and I have to give a shout out because I know some folks are on the call today, the Kent County Dads Count Fatherhood Coalition, they had done an event in 2019 that had ticket sales and had some funding left over from that. We also had some of the organizations that were planning the summit that were able to kick in some funding. And then we had some small sponsorships to cover things like gift cards for our survey respondents. One of our expenditures that we had decided on was to pay our fathers who we had asked to be speakers because we wanted to be sure that we emphasized the value that they added and their contribution. Now, we set up our conference to have sessions each morning in the middle of the week across 3 different days. So we did Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday mornings and had a plenary session each day, some discussion time, and then breakout sessions that were sort of choose your own adventure. And then we had the evening session each day for fathers. And we did our registration through Eventbrite. We did charge a fee for practitioners to attend of just $10, and then there's a separate ticket type for fathers that was free. And then we did purchase a virtual conference networking app. The one that we went with was Whova, and for those who might not be watching and seeing the slides, that's spelled W-H-O-V-A. And I know I've gotten questions from folks in other states about the pricing for Whova. So what we paid was $1,400 for the base price for it. That does not include some of the add-ons that you might want, but I just wanted to mention the cost because I know it can feel prohibitive and it's something you have to plan for. But if you have more time to look into things, there are a lot of apps out there for this, so look into those, and they do increase in price from what we paid. Next slide, please. So one of our biggest takeaways from our event this year was to learn which topics folks found the most valuable. And it was really clear through the live participation and then reiterated in the survey results after the conference that the 2 sessions that I'm going to highlight here were really big hits. So one was called Bias Black and Changing Culture. and really focused on current events in the U.S. and racial justice. And the speaker explained concepts like implicit bias, racism, and microaggressions in really easy to understand ways, and she had a lot of energy and passion about the topic. Another big hit was having a panel of fathers who talked directly about their own experiences of being a father, how they were socialized to be fathers, and then specifically how having a history of incarceration can impact being a father. Next slide, please. So one of our greatest strengths for our summit was that we had a really great team of partners to make our event happen. I've called out some of our partners who are on the call already, but we co-presented the summit between the Kent County Dads Count Fatherhood Coalition and then our state group, the Michigan Action Plan for Father Involvement. And that planning committee was able to draw from our networks and get both speakers and attendees who came from a variety of practice areas, but also geographically a variety of places around our state. We had a lot of participation in the individual Zoom sessions and then also in the Whova event app, so folks were able to send messages and questions a couple different ways. And that participation, I think it's hard to match the feel of an in-person event with anything that's virtual, especially as we're all experiencing Zoom burnout. But having that stream of comments and questions, I think, definitely helps to generate a feeling of excitement and momentum. We also know that a lot of our participants did take advantage of networking opportunities through the Whova app. On the planning committee, we experienced it ourselves, but then also the app provided a lot of statistics about the engagement, like how many profile views there were and how many messages were sent back and forth between people. So we know that folks took advantage of that. And then I also wanted to mention surveys. We were lucky to have a university professor, who Rich actually already mentioned, Dr. Carolyn Dayton, who was on our planning committee, and she developed surveys for us and then also created a summary report of all of the survey feedback after the event so that we could sort of learn what worked and what didn't work and what we should consider going forward. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on a couple highlights that I thought would be most helpful to everybody out there as far as things that we learned. But I also want to mention if anyone is putting together their own event and has, a series of questions that you'd like to ask or get more information on, I'm happy to connect. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to reach out. One of the big things that we learned is that folks wanted to hear more from dads than they did. So we knew that there was a lot of hype about the panel of fathers session, but it also seems like people wanted to hear more from dads, hear more father stories highlighted. Another thing we learned is that the breakout sessions where we had sessions running simultaneously and folks could choose their own adventure, it was difficult to pull off, and we were kind of proud of ourselves that we figured it out. But as it turns out, in the virtual format, there were folks who told us that they wished they would have been able to attend every single session and would have preferred just to have things more spaced out and not had to choose between which things they attended live or not. We also heard that everybody wanted more time to discuss and ask questions after each session, so that's something we'll probably build in the future. Another thing is just the simplicity of how to attend sessions. This kind of overlaps, I'm sure, with the providing virtual programming to dads. But if you have a lot of difficulty sort of organizing all of your links for sessions, it's probably also going to be difficult for people to figure out how to attend. So something we might do in the future is to just use the same Zoom account, same link for every session, and the same password so that there's just one thing folks have to remember and keep track of. Dry run is another thing that I would recommend to everyone. So a practice session with all of your speakers for all of your sessions and have your support team on there so that it gives a chance to work out any kinks and figure out who's going to do what. For example, for our session today that we're doing right now, we had a dry run yesterday so we could figure out how things worked. Also, I wanted to mention marketing your event so that you get the right people who are in your target audience to attend. And that's something you really have to plan for in advance. So make sure that you think about that early on. One thing that we're considering in the future is doing short video teasers from speakers talking about what their sessions will cover. And then my final point that I wanted to leave you with is considering the time of day that you offer your summit sessions if you're going virtual, because we found out that since we had gone virtual, we could actually have folks attend from all over the U.S. and even outside of the U.S. But that also meant that folks in the Pacific time zone, for example, were in Eastern time zone. It was really early for them to get up at like 5:30 in the morning to attend our plenary sessions. So just something to consider, the time of day that you offer your sessions.
Thank you.
And
thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. More from Michigan, this time on policy issues from Erin Fritsch, Director of the Office of Child Support Enforcement.
Thanks, Jessica. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to take a different tack here from the operational and talk a little bit more big picture. And it's interesting when I talk to policymakers about fatherhood and supporting fathers, most of them are actually fathers themselves. But when we talk about this issue, they somehow think we're talking about other fathers, right? Not them. And the fathers they think we're talking about are usually African-American men, usually low income, might have a history of incarceration. And what those policymakers forget, in my opinion, is that those African-American men also love their children. And so when many of our systems were formed, they intentionally or unintentionally set up barriers for fathers to be able to get access to the supports they need to take care of their kids. And our systems have been centered on mothers. You know, the social problem we were trying to solve when the child support program, for example, was created was, you know, the breadwinners of households who happened to be dads leaving their families. And how are we going to take care of those families if their dads weren't? And we all know that that is not what families look like today. And when we're talking about policy and making arguments to policymakers, we need to talk about the fact that the systems we have built were built to marginalize dads in many ways. And so this work is about equity and making sure that we are righting some of the wrongs of the past. There's also this acknowledgement or this tendency, if you will, to forget that fathers are taking care of their families. They may not be in the ways that we can see if you're tracking such things, but I firmly believe that every dad wants to take care of their family with very few exceptions. And really our goal needs to be helping dads be the dads they want to be from a policy perspective. So part of that means making sure we understand that there are dads that are paying child support, but there are also dads who at the same time are taking care of families. And we cannot overcorrect in a way and put one family into poverty as we're trying to help another family out. And the child support program has to deal with that and confront that situation as it is one that is happening a lot. We also need to recognize that investing in fathers is investing in families, which is then an effective anti-poverty strategy. And that investing in fathers doesn't always mean making sure they have the job that pays well. It also means making sure they have access to technology. It means making sure that they have access to parenting time. it's about addressing all of the systemic barriers that get in the way of helping families take care of themselves. Next slide, Jessica. So some things to consider as I talk to policymakers and that I encourage folks to think about as you're wanting to do policy. First and foremost, reliable, dedicated funding for fatherhood support programs is a must. We have a tendency right now to try to cobble together funding from various sources, and unfortunately, I think too many fatherhood programs are not being able to spend enough time actually supporting fathers because they're always worried about, or often worried about, how they're going to keep themselves financially stable. And so really seriously looking at what are the federal government funding streams, what are the state government funding streams that can be used to provide reliable, dedicated funding for father programs. And I think those include things like child support funding and the TANF funding, as well as states thinking about their own general fund and where they're putting their dollars to the greatest use. Fatherhood policies have to be about more than just getting dads jobs. I think that the socialization of fathers around being providers means that employment is important, but it is also about providing stability and coaching and mentoring and all the things it means to be a dad. And our policies, for the most part up until now, have very much focused on how do we make sure dads can pay. And while I don't think we should stop helping dads get good jobs, we also need to be thinking about more than just employment support. What are those healthy relationships, training, and some of the things that the providers here talked about that they are doing. Connecting fathers to their children, I think, is really important. So, when we want to talk about the why behind this, there's lots of research out there about the outcomes for children who have stable, reliable family situations, and the role that fathers play in positive outcomes for kids as they grow. It's also connecting fathers, though, to their other parents, to each other, and to the supports that exist outside of just their immediate family. So recognizing that, part of what has happened over time is fathers have been isolated. So how do we connect them back in? And this is looking at everything from how we do parenting time to recognizing that families are complex and cross multiple different kinds of relationships, and that dads have a role in those in multiple different ways. And then finally, I would offer up that there are really great models of working with folks who worked with the communities we're trying to serve. So how do we pull fathers with actual lived experience in our programs and policies into the conversation so that we have a better understanding of what is needed, what is helping, and what is hurting, and can create policies that actually do just what I said earlier and help dads be the dads they want to be. So I'm very encouraged by models where we have found opportunities to work with local leaders, many of you who are the folks who are on this call, and how we can, at the state level, work with folks to make sure that we are helping and not hurting when it comes to thinking about what are policy measures to take with regard to the child support or to fatherhood programs. So with that, I'm keeping it short and sweet, and I'm moving on. So Jessica, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. And now for Lori's presentation on what research tells us about best practices using virtual forms. Lori?
Thanks, everyone. I just want to say how inspiring it's been, and just really appreciate learning from everyone else on the panel. It's the benefit of going live and all the amazing work being done. So I wanted to just put that out there. And really a lot of what I say here, it's nice to see it implemented, and you all have the hands-on experience. And so my experience is teaching online for a number of years and creating trainings primarily for faculty teaching online. And our students at Temple are really often not traditional college students, so they really just span a range of ages and demographics, comforts with technology, access to technology, and really juggling competing demands. They're working full-time, they're working part-time, they have kids, they're taking care of family members, and this is all before you throw COVID into the mix. So really, I think we've had the benefit of a lot of that experience. So what we see on this slide is just some research that was done on characteristics of adult learners, which I think, as I'm listening to everyone, really just aligns with what you're sharing and what fathers are balancing. They come to the programs with a lot of previous experience, and I'm starting at the bottom, that's really important to them. And so making sure that we integrate opportunities for them to share what they know and what they've done is really crucial to maintain their engagement and really enhances the opportunity for learning amongst everyone. Oftentimes we see adult learners bring an internal motivation to learn. They're participating because they have some personal reason for doing it, right? They're not just in grade school. And so it just looks really different when we're thinking about adults and recognizing that and building upon it. The top one here, and I'm going counterclockwise, but they want to know why they should learn something and how it benefits them. So making sure that whenever we're presenting information, we're connecting it to their lives. How is it going to help them with their own goals? How is it going to help them with their relationships with their children, with their partners, with work, whatever it is in their own communities, and making sure we're making those connections explicit is really helpful. And then that last one, making sure that we recognize that some adults might be resistant to being, quote, told and unquote what to do. And again, really thinking about opportunities for collaboration, for engagement is really important when we're thinking through online or for adult learning. And I think listening to everyone, I would also suggest, struggles as everyone has different schedules. I heard earlier in the beginning, I'm just looking at my notes here, differences in technology. And I think that sometimes taking a few minutes in the beginning of a program, and I recognize that we have ranges of, a series of programs that are covered over, 4 or 6 weeks or maybe a whole day event. But taking some time through registration or that first meeting to intentionally learn who's in the room, whether it be virtual or in person, I think is really important. What experiences do they have? What are their limitations? Are there pets or children? I saw that in one of the chats that might be a distraction. What technology do we have access to? Job constraints. I think it's really important to know ahead of time. So this is a nice a picture of our brain, but what I really want to emphasize here is how complex learning is. And I know I say sometimes to my students, like, why are we so tired at the end of it if we've just been sitting down? And just really, I think it's important to think about that we have over 100 billion neurons in our brain. And so when we're learning new information, what we're doing is either creating connections between existing neurons or strengthening connections amongst neurons or making connections between connections. What does this mean? It means that we don't often learn things the first time we're told. We do learn them and we retain it more when we have opportunities for repeated use again, when we're connecting it to emotions, when we're connecting it to direct experience. When we call it, retrieval practice, when we're having the opportunity to play a game, to play Jeopardy, to maybe pause and reflect on something. And so in new concepts in different ways really enhances that learning. And I think it's really important, especially, with adults, but I would say really with any age, and that's my own personal opinion in terms of learning, but to share with others how complex learning is. And it doesn't have to be more complicated than this. I know they're sending out the slides. There's like a 4-minute video on that learning circuit there that you can play if you're interested. But I think it really helps to get the buy-in if we ask participants to, pause and reflect. If we ask them to take a quiz, and I'm not even saying a quiz for grades, but the idea of quizzing in games really enhances our learning and can be fun. So what does this mean for what we're doing? I think it's really important to integrate choices, right? Whether it be in preparation materials, readings, videos, podcasts, blogs, thinking that we all learn in different ways. We all have prior experience. So the more choices we give people, the more we can respect their autonomy. Giving choices for them to share what they've learned. Again, maybe some of the fathers are really want to write a song or a poem or an essay, or they want to speak, and really providing multiple ways for them to share their experiences and share how they're interacting with these concepts, I think is really important to creating that learning community. And then integrating choices whenever possible and how to access workshops, whether it be via a phone, a computer, or a tablet, is also really important. We also talk about ways to integrate multiple means of participation. And so I mentioned it earlier, reflection is so key. I don't know if you've had the experience. I know I've had it where you ask a question and it's just radio silence, whether it be online or in person. And sometimes something as simple as saying, here's the question. We're all going to literally have 1 minute, 1.5 minutes. Please jot down your answers. It can be on a Word document. It can be on a scrap of paper. It can just be something you're thinking about. And having that silence for about a minute really enhances the participation, because some of us are quick to respond. Others of us need time to really process it and think about, again, how is this question interacting with our experiences and what we've learned. And so that can really enhance the discussion, and it sort of levels the playing field, so to speak, in terms of the multiple learning styles that we have. Also breaking up, if we're delivering content, if we have a program that's really heavy on one-way flow of information, thinking about mini lectures and chunking up concepts into, 5-10 minute videos or lectures can be really important. If we're meeting live, thinking about every 5 minutes, what's an opportunity for people to participate? Is it a poll question? Is it a reflection? Is it a case scenario? Is it a breakout session? What does that look like? And so breaking up the content really helps to keep people engaged. I talked about retrieval practice. I think this is one of my favorite things that have found it really effective as well. And just having opportunities for people to continuously interact with the material is really helpful. And as I said, games, polls, quizzes can be really unique. And then integrate multiple sources of knowledge. And so really thinking about how can we leverage and how can we elevate the experiences of our fathers, the knowledge that you all have as staff members, and the research evidence together. And I think that it enhances the learning for everyone. I want to briefly touch upon inclusivity. And I think that one of the most helpful ways I've had to think about this is that every time we make a decision, we want to ask ourselves, who are we leaving out? And I don't think we often realize how many decisions we make in terms of teaching, programming, events. So every time we make a decision in terms of what technology we're going to use, we're leaving someone out. The day of the week, the time of the workshop, the event, the amount of preparation that's required, the cost to attend. It could be monetary costs, time costs, childcare costs, the font type, the sizes, and the color choices. Our communication choices, email, text, phone call, regular mail. And so there's no right or wrong, but I think being more aware of these decisions that we're making and who we're leaving out helps us to include the largest number of people. I just have here some technology considerations. And so, again, thinking about when we choose technology, sometimes less is more. And here are some considerations we want to think about. I would suggest if we're not going to use the tool multiple times, let's think about whether we really want to spend the time learning it ourselves and teaching other people how to use it. And I think there's so many tools out there. I know there are. I know I get overwhelmed by them. And sometimes really less is more. We can do a lot with Google Docs, with Google Forms. Google Forms happens to be one of my new favorite tools. But so just really thinking about these costs. And then I think this was actually covered in one of the previous sessions, but some tips for practice. I think letting people know ahead of time what we're going to cover and what they should do to be prepared. Should they have their notes with them, a pen, a paper, a quiet space, specific questions, and again, opportunities for participation. If you're using something like Zoom or Microsoft Meetings, thinking about breakout rooms and ways to build community and collaboration is really helpful, and to have a deliverable for people to report back with. I do generally recommend that if you're going to use a breakout session, have it for 15 or 30 minutes. I often see a lot of people have it for like 5 minutes, 2 minutes. It generally takes about 5 minutes for people to settle into the group. So we want to build that time factor into it. And I suggest keeping the groups the same if you're doing a larger workshop, so the members don't have to reintroduce themselves to each other. Here's some other just tips and tricks that I have. Remind Me is an app, so if you find that participants are more likely to respond to text, you can send out text to people and not use their personal phone number if that's a hindrance. As I mentioned, Google Docs, Google Forms. I don't have this here, but I saw it in the chat, and I just wanted to say I think one of the positives sometimes for me I have found is things that are distracting, such as family and pets, looking for ways to invite them into the learning space. And I'm not saying all the time, but sometimes sharing pictures of pets, toddlers, whatnot, can really build community and have the sense that we're all in it together and we're all facing multiple challenges and responsibilities, and it provides ways for people to connect with each other. I think that was it.
Thank you, Lori. Okay, it's time for questions. Please put them in the chat. Here's contact information for Jay and me, and more importantly, we're going to leave this screen up because Amy and others have invited you to get back to them for further conversations. So here's some contact information. Jay, do we have any questions?
Yeah, I have a few questions. So Armin, this is a question for Armin. How did the program handle confidentiality when sharing recorded sessions?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I mentioned because I actually saw that question while I was giving my presentation, and I mentioned that we had all of our guys to sign confidentiality agreements at the beginning of the sessions in terms of the orientation, before we even got started. And we always did that even before we went online. But we also did it again when we went online, and we used Sign Now, so sort of electronic signature software that allow for that. And I also mentioned that in terms of security, I talked about the idea that we explored a couple of different platforms, and while a lot of people were using Zoom, we stayed away from Zoom because at the time we came into knowledge that Zoom was having issues with its security, and that folks were somehow able to hack into Zoom and do weird things in the background and so on and so forth. So anyway, so we went with Microsoft Teams because it allowed us to send secure links so that we could ensure that only the people we intended to receive the links were able to log in. So those are the ways that we tried to wrestle with issues around confidentiality and privacy.
So question for Sherry. So you had spoken about the higher rate of participation. Do you think that this higher rate might mean you'll continue the hybrid approach after the pandemic is over? Hopefully sooner than later?
Yeah, we have actually been taking a look at how we can provide the services that are inclusive of both models. And so what we began doing was having the first week of class actually in seat, and we would enroll up to 9 could actually come into the space. And then for the second through the 6th week, we would go back to the online platform. And so we found this to be helpful in that if Some of the parents had children at home that had to be doing online school. They could be there for that, as well as just some other responsibilities that they may have needed to be attentive to. So, yes, we are looking at continuing with offering some of our services online.
Okay, thank you. So there's another question here. It's difficult to get fathers involved face-to-face. What do you recommend to get fathers to get involved virtually?
Who wants to take a stab?
That's for anyone.
So for us at Fathers and Family Support Center, we are still offering the services that they are in need of. A lot of our fathers come to us, they are non-custodial fathers. They may not have employment and or they may be facing some type of issues with getting visitation and or custody of their children. And it's some of those just basic fatherhood services that we just simply continue to offer for them. I think one of the other things that was pivotal at this time is that we were also able to provide job placements. We had several employers that reached out to us in need of employees, and so we were actually able to make about 114 placements between April 1st and September 30th during this time. So it's still just providing those basic services that our participants are in need of.
Sherry, can you talk about the type of jobs that you were able, that job opportunities that grew during the pandemic?
Right. Here in St. Louis, we have lots of hospitals, and so we had hospitals that needed different positions in their maintenance and or cleaning departments. We also have a huge need for transportation. As you all know, Amazon and UPS business went up, so therefore here locally, some of our warehousing and shipping and logistics positions began to open up as well. And construction never stops. So we had quite a few laborer and or construction positions that we were able to fill as well.
I was just going to add to that. I think the other thing that's important to mention is the way that you frame your program, and I think matters. And so if you talk to dads about things related to like parent education, sometimes, particularly for non-resident dads who oftentimes are already marginalized, they may see that as something that is received as a remedial sort of a situation, and that only reinforces the idea that they have some sort of a deficiency. And so it may be worth your while to give some thought to thinking through how it is you can frame what you do as giving dads an opportunity to have their voices heard. So I think in that way, it shifts some of the expectations around what it is that dads are going to get when they walk through the door. So if it's an opportunity to have their voices heard, many, if not all, of the non-resident dads that we serve are really, really interested in having their voices heard because all of them have a story about what's happening or what hasn't happened in terms of their parenting experiences or co-parenting relationships and so on and so forth. So inviting them to come in and give voice to whatever their lived experiences has been was helpful to us in terms of getting people into the door. Until they come in and we can give them the type of support that they wanted and they get invested.
Armin, did your program change the way it recruits during the pandemic?
So we didn't necessarily change the way, so from a practical standpoint, we weren't out on the streets recruiting people because people weren't out on the streets, but what we did was we largely leveraged our alumni group and said, hey, by the way, the guys who have been through our program, if you would, share our link on social media, let the people that you know and that you come into contact with and the people who trust you, let them know what your experience has been with us and have them to reach out to us if they feel like what we've done based on your word is something that they could benefit from. But again, in terms of that sort of original point, a lot of those original guys were reluctant to join on. It was only after we were able to convince them that we weren't going to wag the proverbial finger at them the way that they had been accustomed to having it wagged at them, that they were willing to give us a chance.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question that says here, we are a rural program, and technology can be a huge factor in delivering a quality class online because fathers don't have access to the internet or fast enough internet. Any suggestions for how to do it in an internet vacuum? Armin, I'm sure you have some rural families that you work with, or
Sherry? So I think depending upon what types of restrictions and policy they have in place about how their program is delivered, I think that may be where some of the asynchronous options may come into play. So if the option is asynchronous or nothing, then it may be that the asynchronous version of the workshop gives you an opportunity to engage guys in ways that otherwise you wouldn't. And it also doesn't require, like I said, a high-speed connection where they're there at the very same time as the facilitators, and if there's delays in terms of bandwidth and so on and so forth. So that may be a reason to explore the asynchronous option.
Sherry, did you want to respond to that? How to deal with the internet vacuum that many fathers in rural communities experience? You're in St. Louis, so I don't know that this pertains to you.
Right. No, we do have access to the internet. However, when we first begun, we didn't have the secure line set up, and so it took us almost a month to get those Zoom accounts in place so that they could be secured. But before we did that, we had our conference call line, and our case management staff, social workers, and employment career advisors would reach out to the participant via phone. And if they were able, they would drop off things, or either the participant would be able to come to the office and pick up packets so that they could stay abreast of things that they needed and or receive the services of the project.
Okay, thank you.
I've read in the newspaper about rural school districts and you creating hotspots just in school buses and parking at lots and so forth around the community. I don't know if that is, and they're at a relatively low cost. I don't know if that's a feasible model to pursue.
So there's another question here. Many practitioners are probably thinking that fathers want to talk about COVID. So does the conversation about COVID and issues pertaining to the pandemic usurp the curriculum, interfere with the delivery of the curriculum with a high level of fidelity? Sherry, would you be willing to address that?
So as a part of our model, the first thing in the morning from that first 45 minutes of the day, we do a What's Up circle, which is just basically unpacking some of the feelings that they're currently experiencing, some of the things that they may have gone through the night before and or that morning before they came into the circle. And so with them being able to sort of express that concern and realize that they're not the only ones dealing with it, that was largely helpful for them to just sort of express their fears and or concerns or some questions that they may have had as it related to COVID and how they could, successfully navigate that whole world of mask wearing and washing hands and hand sanitizer. So it was just a matter of our social service practitioners showing that empathy and allowing that space for them to be vulnerable in that way each day.
Okay, thank you. And what about how do programs handle data collection, pre and post program assessments in a virtual environment? How has that been addressed? Armin, maybe you want to address that?
Yeah, so for a while, we had a little bit of difficulty because our funder would not allow us to use paper and pencil surveys. They wanted us to collect all of the information using their electronic database, but it wasn't very long after we got into the online workshops that our funder relented and allowed us to send our participants paper and pencil surveys that they completed in a sort of a traditional fashion and then sent them back to us, and we had our staff enter those days. So that's the way that we were able to reconcile that. So before we were having to send people links, and then the links would expire for 24 hours, and then I think later on the funder came back and said, well, we're going to extend the period of time that the links would be active, but the electronic links were less successful for us than the paper and pencil surveys that the guys just mailed back to us. It seemed as though they were much more amenable to that than the electronic links.
Okay. Got a couple more questions here. Jessica, do we have another minute or two?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, so question, I guess this would be for Amy. What would be the number one piece of advice that you would give to folks wanting to plan a virtual summit or conference?
Yeah, the biggest thing I would say is start planning early. When we planned our conference and decided to pivot to virtual, we only had a couple months to do that, and we managed to do it, but I think there are a lot of things that we would do differently in the future. You know, I mentioned creating video previews of sessions. You could do a lot more with marketing, so just start that process early and plan what you're going to do in advance.
And perhaps a question for Erin. What would you say is the most important father-friendly policy that needs to be addressed at this time, during the pandemic? What would be the really critical policy that needs to be addressed?
Did you say that was for
Wow.
For Erin.
So this is Erin. I don't know if I could pick just one, but for me, definitely at the top of that list is probably parenting time and access, and making sure that in the context of COVID, that fathers have the ability to connect with their children in all the ways that are meaningful to them is really, to me, one of the most important things at this time. And then probably followed up with that would be addressing the economic hardship that COVID has caused, and recognizing that there is special attention that could be paid to fathers in particular who are supporting families to make sure they have the economic supports they need.
A massive job creation initiative might be helpful, huh?
Yep. I would also personally advocate for
fingers crossed.
Not taking economic stimulus payments necessarily from fathers if we get another round of those.
And Rich, from your standpoint, what would you say in answer to this question? What do you think are the really important policies that should be addressed during this difficult time?
Yeah, well, I would echo that. Everything is, there's a web of the way these are all tied together. So sometimes it is hard to pick, but I guess in the most immediate stance, I know that there's been efforts and adjustments already made, but making sure that this latest round, if it occurs, of stimulus checks, personal payment gets to people who really need them. Is going to be important. And I think maybe that's already been to some extent addressed, but I think there's needs to be implemented effectively to make sure those get in people's hands. That's just an immediate COVID priority. But so many other things that we've talked about intersect and interlock from, and transforming which I think this is Aaron's soapbox and so well put, but transforming the child support system from a system of economic surveillance and help and getting dads or non-residential parents, mainly dads, to pay, turning that to a system that really provides support in those ways is the broad umbrella that I would say is really key and doable.
Yes.
Okay, we're at time. Yeah. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to all the participants who signed on. This will be recording will be posted along with the slides on FRPN.org within the next 2 days. And stay well and enjoy the rest of the day.